Okay, so we're going to talk today about Westernization. Okay, when I say Westernization, what's the first thing that occurs to you? What do you think I'm going to talk about? What do you think?
Cowboy boots.
America, cowboy boots, all that kind of stuff. Okay, except Chris is kidding. But America, we're talking about the effect of America on the modern world, right? Except we're not, because we are way back in history before that. We're back in the part of history where America is just starting to be a presence at all. So we're actually not talking about.
Yeah, Westernization is more like almost not colonialism, but I guess what you call a Western moral point of view and ethic, isn't it?
This is why I wanted to start with a definition before we got into it, because actually Westernization refers to something much older than that. It refers to the movement of Mediterranean powers into Asian regions. It refers to taking cultures from the western part of Eurasia, which would be Europe, and moving them over into the eastern part of Eurasia, which would be Asia. So this picture here, which is what a lot of people think of, that's the Merca picture kind of what Westernization is. We don't get to that until much later. And that's really more Americanization than Westernization. Okay, so I just want you to dispense with that right off the bat. And remember that that's not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is those moments in history where a culture that's centered around the western part of that massive continent infiltrates and becomes a part of the rest of that continent. So what kinds of things move over when that happens? Culture, religion, and technology, yes. But in a lot of cases, it's not modernization, because Western culture is often behind the technology of Asia when it moves in. Asia actually has technologies earlier than a lot of the European countries do, than a lot of the European societies do. So like gunpowder moved over the other direction, and then rifled muskets moved this way. So gunpowder comes in from China and into the Mediterranean. The Mediterranean powers get a hold of it and restructure the weaponry around it, and then it comes back. And what comes with it during this trade process, the thing that you trade the most are priorities and norms. Okay, it's not so much technology, and it is religion, but the religion kind of changes as it moves over. It's what are your priorities as a society and what is normal in your society. Those are the things that most move over during Westernization. So I have a picture here of the Meiji Emperor, who we talked about last week. And compared to all of the emperors of Asia that we looked at before that, what do you notice right off the bat is the difference between this emperor and the emperors that we looked at from Japan before that?
He looks more like a European general versus the long robes and the tall hats.
Right, long robes and tall hats are gone. He is in a uniform that is styled to look like a European uniform. His hair is cut short. He has a saber at his side instead of and he has the big Napoleon hat. I mean, he is designing himself to look like what a European would recognize as a soldier, as a military leader. So why would he do that? In the era that he is doing this, why would he want to make sure that they knew that that's what he was? Above being a spiritual leader and above being a cultural leader, he is choosing to look like a military leader. So why do that?
Well, wasn't it partially because when they reopened their borders for trading and stuff like that, they were very assuredly not wanting to have the same thing happen to them that happened to China. They wanted to be recognized as a power.
Right. So what he's done is adopt the priorities of the West. And the priorities of the West at that time are military conquest. That is one of their greatest priorities. And that is
He's made himself less of a target.
More than that, he made himself stand as an equal. More than that, he wanted to stand as an equal. So we're going to talk about the history of Westernization a little bit. Westernization actually goes back much further than you think. Probably one of the earlier examples of Westernization is Alexander the Great. And you have to go back to like 500 BC for Alexander the Great. I have to look that up in order to be sure about that. But for those of you who didn't take my relative one class, Alexander the Great was a king of Macedonia who led an incredibly large conquest over most of the land around the Mediterranean. He took land in the western part of the Mediterranean, in the north part of Africa. He retook Egypt. He took control, and in all of these places that he went, he deposited his culture. He deposited Macedonia, which was basically Greek culture, in all of these places. So if you look at a map of his conquests, what jumps out at you? All these major cities that he created.
All of the Alexandria.
All of the cities that are named Alexandria, that's right. He dropped Alexandrias everywhere he went so that it would establish trading centers and military centers that were related to Macedonia, that were related to his kingdom. And as such, he transplanted the cultures that were there and made the priorities and norms of his culture. And obviously this is a stolen picture because the watermark is still on it, but you can see where I got it from, so it's cited. Anyway, what followed after Alexander the Great was his empire didn't last very long after his death. I mean, it kind of broke into pieces. But a little way after that, this is about 120 AD. This is about 120 or so. This is the Roman Empire in about 120 AD. They've managed to conquer not just the whole area that Alexander did, but also up into a lot of Europe. And everywhere that they went, they deposited Roman culture. Now, the Romans were a city-state of the Greeks when they started. So what they actually deposit everywhere they go is actually what we call Hellenistic Roman, which means Rome as attached to the Hellenistic traditions of the Greeks. So everywhere they go, they spread the cultures, the priorities, and the norms of the Roman Empire. They do that through military power. They do it by appointing senators and by backing those senators up with military force. But the fact of the matter is, whatever you thought was important, whatever you thought was the hill you were willing to die on before the Romans got to where you were, you set that aside in order to live peacefully with the Romans. Okay, so your priorities as a, for example, German barbarian might seem really important to you until the Romans get there and you have to like adjust your priorities to fit theirs. Okay, so even in combat with the Romans, you still made their priorities your priorities because they were the biggest thing that was threatening you right now. So everywhere the Romans went, they westernized because everywhere that they went, they brought their culture with them. A really good example of this is Russia. So we're going to talk today about a little bit about the history of Russia, which I just like to talk about because I think Russia is fascinating, but we don't have time to get into it for more than one class period. So we're going to just zoom right across the whole history of Russia real quick. Russia, for a very long time, was a very tribal people. Yeah, I'm ignoring you. Just in case you didn't know, that's me.
Right. Okay.
I'm stopping everything to tell you.
That's okay.
So it doesn't really count. But anyway,
Okay.
for a long time, the area that we think of as Russia, and remember, geographically speaking, a lot of Russia you can't live in. Really, you can live in it, but you can't really build complex societies in it because it's basically the Arctic Circle. But all of the parts of Russia that are agriculturally sound, that you can grow food in, they had tribal sort of nomadic cultures that built up around those areas. And they were very diverse, they were very different from each other, and they warred with each other. The Silk Road goes to the south of this, but there is a branch of trade that comes out of China that goes up into the north here. And there are branches of trade that go into this area of what is now Russia, specifically because it's the most agriculturally nice place. So there's more of a likelihood of people there. There was a horse culture there that was, I don't know if y'all remember the bleeding horses. Yeah, that we talk about the horses that for some reason sweated blood and were very valuable to the Chinese. There's a whole horse culture built up around there. These are tribal people. In the 800s or so, an influx of Vikings and Varangians and expansive warrior people came into the area and began taking over the tribes. And eventually those bigger powers that were taking over the smaller tribes began to fight with each other until they basically formed into one sort of mega tribe, and that was the Rus. And that were united under Rurik of the Rus during the 800s. Rurik managed to pull together enough of a power base that he was able to take the couple of major trading cities that were actually in Russia, including Kiev. Kiev was a trading hub of all of these little tribal villages, and it had grown into kind of a city-state of its own. And Rurik and his descendants were able to take over and become basically the Rus, the Kievan Rus people, which were people that were capable of trading as a whole with, for example, China and with European countries. So they're still their own people. They're still very much attached to that tribal warrior kind of mentality, but they are a tradable people. The Russian Orthodox Church, or the Christianity moves into the area. It takes a while for Christianity to gain a foothold among the Rus, but when it does, they're very militant about it. And we have the beginning of the Russian Orthodox Church, which kind of is what we call the Russian Golden Age, because when Orthodox Christianity comes in, it brings with it the Byzantine Empire and all of the learning and philosophy and lifestyles and castle building of the Byzantines into right among the Rus. So this is the first wave of Westernization to hit Russia, is when the Byzantine Empire, which is around like where Turkey is, it's the western part of the Mediterranean, when the Byzantine Empire sweeps up into the Kievan Rus and deposits their culture in, and that becomes like a new culture. The blend between the Byzantines and the Rus becomes a new culture. This is what we call the Russian Golden Age. And this isn't about like 900 kings like Vladimir the Great. There's always greats in Russia. And we got to watch out for that word, because when they say great, they mean several different things, because Ivan the Great is also Ivan the Terrible. And it's actually because it's the same word in Russian. It also means Ivan the Formidable or Ivan the Badass, basically. So it's all kind of the same word. When they say the great, they don't mean what a great guy. They mean the extremely large and powerful, basically. So we have Vladimir the Great in the late 900s, who basically presides over this golden age of Russia. That's the first wave of Westernization. During the 11th and 12th centuries, a bunch of Turkic tribes begin to attack Eastern Europe, and the Slavic people begin to flee into Russia. As they flee into Russia, they overturn the whole population and make a mess out of it. They basically turn it into soup, and it becomes impossible to rule as a unit, and basically it falls apart. So the Golden Age ends with this influx of Slavs who are fleeing from the Turks and all that kind of stuff. It all falls apart. And then Genghis Khan comes through. Okay, so the Mongolian invasion comes through right after that. And they basically destroy Kiev, and a bunch of little separate states arise in the wake of this. The one most powerful, yeah, this is the Golden Horde. This is the Mongolians coming through. The Golden Horde comes through and attacks the Rus people. And I particularly like this because I think this is a really, really extra way to ride into battle. I don't know what you think, but you see what's happening here? This wagon that's carrying this dome that has this warrior on it that's being pulled by like a whole herd of oxen. Like, just ride a horse, dude. Anyway, but the most powerful person to resist is the Duke of Moscow. It's one of the separate states that arises is Moscow, and Moscow has a grand duchy. And that grand duchy manages to push out the Mongol horde, push out the leadership that they've placed. Even though they were there for like 200 years, the leadership that they put in place, he manages to push them out, and then begins uniting all of these little city-states under Moscow. And by the time we get to Ivan the Terrible, or possibly Ivan the Great, it's about the 1500s now. So just for reference, this is at the same time that Cortez is going over to America in 1519, you know, so the Reconquista's already happened to Spain. Now is when the Rus are actually getting rid of the Golden Horde, okay? So the leadership that was put in place by Genghis Khan all those years ago, they're finally now chasing them out. And Ivan the Terrible manages to unite several of these big city-states under one leader. And the whole region becomes united, and he is the first one to call himself the King of the Russians, okay? From 1550, from him taking power to about 1700, the region called Russia grew about 35,000 kilometers a year, okay? It expanded and expanded and expanded until it was a large chunk of what we call Russia. He was the first, what we would call a Tsar, and he handed that down through generations, through the family that we call the Romanovs. The Romanovs are still around, by the way. I don't know if you know, but you could still find.
Yeah, but we know how that ended.
Yeah, that's they were displaced during the beginning of World War I and executed, but there were so many of them by that point. It's a big tree that there are still actually Romanovs around. So this is early in the Romanov dynasty. Peter the Great became Tsar of Russia. By this time, we're in 1682. So we've already got Jamestown, we've already got all the English colonies have been established. Plymouth Plantation has been established. The French have established colonies. We're talking about Eastern European or Western Europe has already started establishing empires. Peter inherited the throne when he was 10 years old. There was a little bit of a kerfluffle because his father died and left the throne to his older brother, and then his older brother died, but his older brother had been married twice, and both of those marriages had resulted in children. And so the children went to war with each other and basically wiped each other out. And so it became down to a choice between letting one set of grandchildren or the other set of grandchildren inherit the throne, or letting the brother of the former king inherit the throne instead. And the Council of Russian noblemen got together and said, all of these people are a mess. The oldest of the older brothers is sick. We're going to give it to the 10-year-old. And so they gave the entire tsardom to a 10-year-old and then put the kingdom basically in the charge of his mother, who was a fairly reliable leader. She was actually a pretty gifted leader. So he grew up as Tsar of Russia, but didn't actually need to be in charge of anything for the first like 10 years of his reign. So instead,
is this what the TV show is based on?
The TV show?
Yeah, there's an HBO show that came out. I think it's called Peter the Great. It's about him and his wife.
It's probably about Peter the Great.
He's a jackass.
Yes, I agree, but let's explain exactly how he's a jackass. Because from the time that he was 10 to the time that he was 17, he didn't actually have to do any of his official duties. He basically just went and played. He went and played, he engaged in hobbies. And one of his kind of odd hobby, and he traveled to Europe. Sometimes he traveled to Europe undercover. Sometimes he went in disguise so that people couldn't recognize that he was the Prince of Russia, so that he could get into the bars and like hang out and do stuff. What he discovered was that the cultures of the East, of the European countries, were much more interesting than anything that Russia had to offer. And one fascination that he had above all others was shipbuilding. He really thought that the naval forces of the British at the time were wildly impressive. And he thought, I want a navy for Russia, which is landlocked. I want a place where I can launch boats from. So when he did assume the throne at about 17 or 18 years old, when he did finally step up into power, he made that one of his priorities. He went into Europe and he studied the Enlightenment. Like we were talking about the Enlightenment happening in all those parlors where people would sit around and talk philosophy. He participated in those conversations. He went to Paris, he went to England, and he participated in those conversations. He wanted to bring all of that stuff back with him. So this is an attempt by a leader to westernize his own country, okay? To bring the ideals of like France and England back into Russia. But mostly what he wanted was ships. So what he decides to do, he arranges the marriage of one of his nieces to the Duke of this area that's kind of right outside Estonia, and as a result ends up with a piece of land that's right on the edge of the Baltic Sea. And he builds a capital city there so that he can have a naval capital city, okay? Because if you go any further this way on this map, you end up in the Atlantic Ocean. Because this is like Finland, Sweden, and Norway, and then over here is England. And so this gives him access to the ocean if he can get past Finland and Sweden and Norway, which will be a problem sometimes for Russia. But St. Petersburg is still there. St. Petersburg is still, even though the USSR has fallen apart, St. Petersburg is still part of Russia, even though there are other holdings here that kind of cut it off. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania are usually in danger because of that, because it sure would be nice, Putin thinks, if he could just take those properties and have more coastal land. Who is it that's studying Estonia? Is that you, Christina? Have you run into any of this sort of conflict in what you've seen? Everybody's fighting over Estonia, and that's because it provides a sea presence for a landlocked country. Okay, so he begins building St. Petersburg. When he was 17 years old, his mother forced him to marry, and he really didn't want to. So after being married to this woman for 10 years, he forced her into a convent, and then ultimately will end up basically torturing and killing his son through her. So he was a jackass. Yes, I agree. But he marries another woman and has heirs through that family too, and then those heirs end up fighting with each other. It's a mess. One of the other things that he wants to bring over from Europe is their dress code. And just so you know, the two leaders, the leader of France and the King of England at this time, this is what they look like. Okay, so this is Louis XVI and this is Charles II. And this is who's in charge of those European countries that he would have seen as a teenager. Fabulous, just so fabulous. And he wants to bring that back. And at this point, the Russians are still kind of dressing the way they've always dressed, which is stout boots. What they're wearing is almost still medieval. Stout boots, long robes, layers of long clothing, long tunics. And there's a reason, there's a geographical reason why they dress that way. It's the most logical way to dress. But when he comes back and begins to institute a new dress code, he wants them to put on the tight-fitting, high socks and these things here, and the high-heeled shoes. He wants those things to be in his court. And one of the other things is he wants people to cut off their beards. The Russians are very big about having beards, and as you can see, that's not popular in Western culture at the time. So he institutes a beard policy that says that if you want to keep your beard, you have to pay a special tax to do it.
It's so cold there.
I'm sorry?
But it's so
But
cold.
it's so cold. Yes, Russia is much colder than a lot of the countries that are dressing this way. But it doesn't matter because he wants Russia to be recognized as just like, I have to go back a long way. Okay, just like this guy here, he wants for the European powers to recognize the nobility of Russia as equal to them. And he believes the way to do it is to have them dressed like this. I kind of think that they'd have been, well, anyway. So he institutes a beard tax. If you want to keep your beard, you have to pay a tax. And when you pay your tax, you get a little medal that you have to wear around your neck at all times so that anybody who sees you with a beard will also see your medal. So that they'll know that you paid for the right to have a beard. Okay. So, yeah, he was pretty special. Okay, but in 1772, the Safavid leader became very sick. Do y'all have any memory at all of who the Safavids are? Okay, they're like a Muslim force in Iran. Okay.
Yeah.
All right, so the Safavid leader becomes very ill, and Peter takes advantage of this moment to try to get a hold in the Caspian and the Black Sea. So he goes to war with the Safavids in the hopes that he can have sea access to the Caspian Sea and the Black Sea. If he can get access to the Caspian Sea and the Black Sea, then he can launch attacks on the Ottoman Empire and get access to the Mediterranean. But that's a high priority for him, is to continuously get sea access, okay? Because otherwise his country is almost entirely landlocked. He can't get to the ocean anywhere. He is not really very successful. He gets access to the Caspian Sea, but he doesn't actually make it very far to the Black Sea before his death. So, and after his death, because he was driving those Westernization forces with all of his might, after his death, people grew their beards back. Like people were like, we're done with that, right? And put the boots back on. And so all of his attempts to make Russia a recognized European power kind of fell by the wayside because they were driven by his love of what he had studied in Europe and were not familiar with most of the other Russian noblemen. It isn't until his grandson marries. Yeah, okay, so here's a map, and we'll come back to this in a few minutes, but here's a map. Hold on, let me get rid of the chat. The Great. Oh, the show that you're thinking on, The Great, I think it's about Catherine, actually, Jordan. But well, I don't know, I'd have to check it out, but I think The Great you're talking about is actually about Catherine. And that's Peter the Third, not Peter the First, which we're going to talk about next. So this is where, this is the Duchy of Moscow, is this little purple version right here. This is where it started. Okay, by the end of Peter's reign, everything in light orange belongs to him, and everything in sort of medium orange has been acquired. Okay, so yeah, it starts off with Ivan in, you know, the Duchy of Moscow and expands all the way out to here. His grandson, Peter III, married a young girl from Germany. Well, and we say Germany as though there was actually a Germany, there's not, but she married a German princess, a princess from one of those little kingdoms that will eventually become Germany, named Sophie. And Sophie was she was young and she was energetic, but she was not happy in her marriage, and she had reason to believe she might be much smarter than her husband. And I think if you review most of the historical documents, you'll find out that that's probably true. Peter III was an idiot. He was not good at performing any of his kingly duties, which was unfortunate for Sophie. And under his command, she was afraid that all of the holdings of all of the things that Peter had managed, Peter the First managed to pull together, would fall apart. So she essentially overthrows him. He takes the throne at the death of his mother, who is queen. He takes the throne, and within 6 months, she has him deposed. She has him, she attacks him inside a castle. She goes to the troops herself and says to the soldiers, "Do you guys really want this guy to be your king? I mean, you've seen him in action. He's a terrible human being. He's such a bad leader." And the military almost universally decides to support her instead of him. Okay, so she, who is not a Russian, is now going to take the throne away from her husband. And the idea is she already has a son, so if she takes the throne and becomes queen of Russia, she means to hand it off to her son, right? I mean, everybody assumes that's what she's going to do. So it's okay as a military to support her, because she's totally going to hand this all over to her son as soon as her son is old enough, except that she doesn't. What she does instead is when she was made the marriage contract, she changed her name to Catherine, which was the name of Peter I's second wife, the one he actually liked. She becomes a Russian Orthodox. She basically turns herself inside out to be as Russian as possible from the get-go. And when it becomes time for her husband to actually take the throne, by that time she's already built a reputation for being more connected to the Russian nobility than he is. So she has more of the support than he does. So she has him arrested and thrown into jail. 6 months after he takes the throne, she has him arrested and thrown into jail, and she takes the throne and he dies in custody. It's a good chance he was assassinated, but he dies in custody. And rather than handing the throne over to her son and saying, "No, no, I'm just holding on to it until he gets big enough because he's still a kid," she basically takes command of Russia and dubs herself Catherine the Great, using the same title Ivan did and Peter did, so that people will feel a continuity, that this is just another iteration of that great force of unifying Russianness. And that is who she is. And that is, yeah, you're talking about Peter. I mean, Peter I was a jackass, but Peter III is probably who that show's about, Jordan. All right, so let's talk about the situation in Russia when Catherine takes charge. First of all, one of the things you need to know is that Russia was still feudal, meaning that there were still serfs. We haven't had serfs in England or in France since about the 1500s. But at the time that Catherine takes control, which is in the 1700s, there are still serfs. Do y'all know what a serf is? Is that a term you're familiar with?
Like the people that serve the knights of stuff like that, like the really low poverty.
Right, and they're owned by other people. Like if you're a serf, you belong to somebody. You're the contract of your labor belongs to them. You can't flee and work for somebody else. It's not a job that you've taken. It's basically slavery, except that you get paid also, and you're able to produce enough wealth that you're able to actually feed your own family. So it's slavery if slaves are allowed to own things, basically. So there are still serfs in Russia. As a matter of fact, Catherine owns about 500,000 of them herself. Okay, and most of the nobility owns serfs. So most of the economy of Russia is still built on serfdom. So that's one of the things that Westernization has not managed to bring over from Europe, is the freeing of the middle class. The closest that Catherine gets is that she starts trying to establish an economy that will make it so that the middle class can rise somewhat. Because what happens in most, and we'll talk about this in more detail on Thursday, the middle class, is what happens is that the more wealth that can move through merchants, the more people that can sell their labor to the middle class instead of using it in agricultural pursuits, the higher an economy a country gains, because it makes it easier for them to trade with other countries. So she establishes sort of a central bank to regulate the money of Russia, and that bank prints paper money, which is the first time that that's happened. But that's something she picked up on her travels from Germany, was the idea of paper money, money that isn't actually coins, but represents some amount of silver that's in a bank somewhere. The nice thing about money is that you can always print more, even if there maybe isn't actually the silver to back it up. So that allows her merchant class to grow somewhat. Now she tries to regulate her merchant class and be like, y'all can start to be productive, but the government's going to be controlling how you do it. And the merchants basically say, or maybe we'll just not be productive. And so that doesn't really work out very well. But the other thing that she does is she opens the door for German agricultural people to move from the German countryside into the Russian countryside and begin doing agriculture in Russia. As a result, the bulk of the agriculture is still being done by serfs, but not all of those serfs are owned by the people whose land they work. So it sort of starts to unravel the serf system, but not really. As she begins to negotiate for power among the Europeans, she gets laughed at a lot. Like, she's not respected by European powers. This is a cartoon that's making fun of the Shakespearean play, the Taming of the Shrew, which I don't know if y'all are familiar with that. Y'all ever heard of the Taming of the Shrew? You ever seen 10 Reasons I Hate You, or what is it called? That was kind of an old movie, I guess. Heath Ledger movie. No? Okay.
Yeah, it was the 10 Reasons I Hate You.
Yeah, that movie is based on Taming of the Shrew. Anyway, the idea is that somebody should definitely get control of this woman, because she's got her eye on the Ottoman Empire. She's got her eye on that same piece of land that Peter wanted to target, so that she could have access to the Black Sea. And you could see him hiding behind European countries. And they're basically threatening her from the back of what is a horse that is starving, that they can't ride any further because they're all stretched really thin by the wars that they've been having. But the promise is that they're going to attack her to protect the Ottoman Empire. And because of that, she actually does attack the Ottoman Empire. In the Russo-Turkish War of 1768, she manages to gain land. She manages to gain access to land using her holdings up here in these islands up here. She manages to attack and for a little while gain a foothold on that on the edge of the Mediterranean. And as a result, they make more cartoons about her. I don't know if you can see what's happening in this one, but this is her stretching from Russia to Constantinople.
They're all looking up her skirt.
They're all looking up her skirt. Yeah, they're all deriding her as she does, as she stretches out way beyond where she should be, being totally inappropriate and everything. So she wasn't very popular with the European powers. So it's hard to bring in European culture when European culture doesn't like you very much. But she did try. She established a foothold for arts in Russia. She began to massively import French and English art, sciences. She brought in scientists. She brought in philosophers. Voltaire came and lived with her for a while and called her the Star of the North and wrote books about her because he lived at her court, and she filled the entire Winter Palace with art. And it became the Hermitage Museum. And it stayed that way for a long time. It's going to get trashed in about 1917. It's going to get trashed. But for a long time she had, and she rewarded art and talent in her own people. Yes.
In the museum that you were just on, isn't that the one they did like there was a great mystery about where all the gold and stuff like that went?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the one you're thinking of.
Okay, I thought I recognized that. Okay, cool. Sorry.
No, you're right. But when it was actually disrupted before in 1917 when the Red October happened. 1917? I don't know. That part of my brain is not working right now. So whenever it was, and we'll talk about it as we get closer to it. But then it was also plundered by the Nazis. So it's hard to, all of those riches. Anyway, she also wanted to institute Western education. And the way that she thought about doing that was to insist, kind of the way the guy that the Meiji Emperor in Japan did, to insist on education for all children for free and mandatory education, so that an entire class of educated people, except for serfs. I mean, let's not be unreasonable here, not serfs. But what she realized very quickly was that the noble people of Russia, the noble class of Russia, didn't really like the idea of an entire, I guess it's kind of like, you know, Gen Z's coming up thinking they know everything. They didn't really like the idea of a whole generation of young people being better educated than they were. They wanted to keep the educational institutions they had. So under command of the Queen, they put their money into these educational institutions, but they didn't send their own kids there. Okay, so what she started was, one of the projects that she started was an orphanage. So that children who were born extramaritally or children who were orphaned could be experimented on educationally. So they were brought into this orphanage in Moscow, the foundling orphanage of Moscow. And the idea was to take these children whose parents couldn't interfere because they didn't exist, and give them these educational tools and see what happened. The problem was that the mortality rate at this orphanage was so high that most of the kids didn't live long enough to actually show what they could do with the education they received. So you ended up with a whole orphanage of really smart but also dead kids. So instead, she began to institute a program of looking for talent among the serfs, and noblemen who owned serfs could recommend serfs that they thought were really talented, really beautiful, had a lot of potential. If a really particularly beautiful child was born, then that child would be sent to the palace to be raised as something else, raised as an actress or raised as a performer, raised as a ballet dancer. This is kind of where we get the beginning of the Moscow Ballet. It's changed a lot over the years, but this is kind of its foundation, is where serf children were taken against their will and schooled in how to be extremely talented ballet dancers. And that was their life. So she tried to bring the arts and sciences in, but it was an effort that she was kind of doing against. So the whole, basically, I want to come back to this in a minute. Basically, during the years after Catherine's reign, and it was a long reign, during the years after Catherine's reign, what she had basically done was elevate the nobility enough so that they could compete with the Europeans, but she'd left the feudal system in place. What that meant was that nobility married into the European royal families. And when they did, they brought their culture with them. So the princesses of England would marry into the Russian nobility, and they would bring English customs with them. And the Russian nobility would adopt some of those customs, and they would become sort of part of the flavor of the Tsar and part of the flavor of the royal household, but it wouldn't filter down any further than that. So this is actually the result of the Westernization done in kind of a patchy way, means that at the turn of the 20th century, what we end up with is an extremely wealthy, extremely well-appointed and well-dressed royal class in the house of the Tsar, and in the nobility, in the Russian nobility, and feudal serfs. So in the 1900s, we still have photographs of serfs, because serfs still exist in Russia. We still have the same feudal system in Russia that was there in the 1500s, that was there in the 1300s, That feudal system has always been, as a matter of fact, they're still doing agriculture the same way. They're still using horse-drawn carriages to do agriculture long after big plowing machines have been put into use in America and in Europe. So that's the effect of Westernization on Russia. Y'all have any questions about that?
And we wonder why they burned the palace.
We don't wonder. We know exactly why they did it. We made fun of Marie Antoinette quite a bit for the let them eat cake thing, which she probably never actually even said. But the whole thing where there's such a divide between the nobility and the peasantry that it's just it's intolerable, and they have to rise up, and there's a revolution, and you know the peasant class rises up against the middle class and rises up against the nobility and beheads 30,000 of them, and it's because the distance between peasant and noble is so far. But in Russia, it's like so much further. The distance between the nobility in Russia and is because the nobility actually does get westernized, but it doesn't filter down to any of the rest of their country. They don't actually manage to develop a strong middle class. They never actually did manage to develop an economic system in which wherever you're born, you have individual worth. So they picked and chose which parts of the Enlightenment would work for the royalty. And they brought those back with them and then let Russia just stay isolated for the rest of it. You think this might be a problem later? What do you think? One of the biggest, and we'll talk about this as we get into the wars, but this is evident especially in World War I, when the weaponry of Europe goes against the horse-drawn battle units of Russia.
I mean, mostly what Russia had was people to throw out their problems.
Pretty much, they have a population, and that's pretty much what they have. So